The Book of Leviticus Summary, Chapter 1. The Burnt Offering. The Lord calls Moses from the tabernacle and begins explaining the sacrificial system that will define Israel's worship. The burnt offering represents complete dedication to God, as the entire animal is consumed by fire on the altar. When someone brings an offering, it must be a male animal without defect from the herd or flock. The worshiper places their hand on the animal's head, symbolizing the transfer of sin and identification with the sacrifice. The animal is then slaughtered at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Aaron's sons, the priests, present the blood and splash it against the sides of the altar. The worshiper cuts the animal into pieces, and the priest arranges them on the burning wood of the altar. The internal organs and legs must be washed with water before being burned. If the offering comes from the flock, whether sheep or goat, the same procedures apply. For those who cannot afford larger animals, birds such as doves or young pigeons are acceptable. The priest brings the bird to the altar, wrings off its head, and drains the blood on the side of the altar. After removing the crop and feathers, he burns the bird on the altar. This offering produces an aroma pleasing to the Lord, signifying God's acceptance of the worshiper's devotion. The burnt offering serves as atonement, making the worshiper right with God. It demonstrates complete surrender and consecration to the Lord's service. Through this sacrifice, the Israelites learn that approaching a holy God requires proper acknowledgement of sin and wholehearted commitment to His covenant. Chapter 2. The Grain Offering. The grain offering, unlike animal sacrifices, consists of fine flour, olive oil, and frankincense. This offering represents the fruits of human labor and acknowledges God's provision of daily sustenance. When someone brings a grain offering, they can present it in several forms. The raw offering consists of fine flour mixed with oil and frankincense, from which the priest takes a memorial portion to burn on the altar. Alternatively, the grain offering can be baked in an oven as thick loaves or thin loaves, both made without yeast and mixed with oil. It can also be cooked on a griddle or in a pan, always prepared with oil. The worshiper breaks the offering into pieces and pours oil on it before presenting it to the priest. Aaron's sons burn the memorial portion on the altar as a food offering to the Lord, creating a pleasing aroma. The rest of the grain offering belongs to the priests as their portion of the food offerings, considered most holy. Every grain offering must be made without yeast, as yeast and honey must never be burned on the altar to the Lord. However, yeast and honey can be brought as first fruits offerings, though they are not burned as pleasing aromas. All grain offerings must be seasoned with salt, representing the covenant between God and his people. Salt must never be absent from grain offerings, symbolizing the lasting nature of God's covenant. When bringing first fruits, the offering should be crushed, heads of new grain roasted in fire, mixed with oil and frankincense. This offering acknowledges God as the source of all provision and prosperity. Chapter 3. The Fellowship Offering. The fellowship offering, also called the peace offering, celebrates communion with God and others. Unlike the burnt offering, which is completely consumed, portions of the fellowship offering are eaten by the worshippers and priests, symbolizing a shared meal with God. If offering an animal from the herd, whether male or female, it must be without defect. The worshipper lays their hand on the animal's head and slaughters it at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Aaron's sons splash the blood against the sides of the altar. From the fellowship offering, specific parts are designated for burning. The internal fat, covering and surrounding the internal organs, both kidneys with the fat on them near the loins, and the long lobe of the liver. The priests burn these on the altar atop the burnt offering as a food offering, creating an aroma pleasing to the Lord. If bringing an offering from the flock, whether sheep or goat, the same procedures apply. For a lamb offering, it is presented before the Lord, hands laid on its head, then slaughtered in front of the tent of meeting. The priests handle the blood and burn the designated fat portions. If offering a goat, identical procedures are followed. All the fat belongs to the Lord as a perpetual statute for generations to come. The Israelites must never eat any fat or blood wherever they live. This prohibition emphasizes that life and the richest portions belong to God alone, reserved for his altar. Chapter 4. The Sin Offering. The sin offering addresses unintentional sins committed against the Lord's commands. Different procedures apply depending on who commits the sin, reflecting varying levels of responsibility within the community. When the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, he must bring a young bull without defect as a sin offering for his sin. He presents the bull at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the Lord, lays his hand on its head, and slaughters it there. The priest then takes some of the bull's blood into the tent of meeting, dips his finger in the blood, and sprinkles it 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain of the sanctuary. He puts some blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense before the Lord, pouring out the rest at the base of the altar of burnt offering. All the fat is removed and burned on the altar, just as with the fellowship offering. However, the hide and all remaining flesh, including the head, legs, internal organs, and intestines, must be taken outside the camp to a ceremonially clean place and burned on a wood fire. When the entire Israelite community sins unintentionally, they follow similar procedures with a young bull. The elders lay hands on the bull's head, representing the community. When a leader sins unintentionally, he brings a male goat without defect, following modified procedures appropriate to his position within the community structure. Chapter 5. The Guilt Offering. This chapter addresses specific situations requiring a guilt offering and outlines provisions for those unable to afford standard sacrifices. When someone sins by failing to speak up as a witness, touching ceremonial uncleanness, or making a rash oath, they become guilty and must confess their sin. They bring a female lamb or goat as a sin offering, and the priest makes atonement for their sin. If someone cannot afford a lamb, they may bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a sin offering and one for a burnt offering. The priest offers the sin offering first, wringing its neck without severing it completely. He sprinkles some blood on the side of the altar and drains out the rest at the base. The second bird is offered as a burnt offering according to prescribed regulations. The priest makes atonement for the sin, and the person is forgiven. If someone cannot afford 2 birds, they may bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a sin offering. They must not put oil or incense on it, as it is a sin offering. The priest takes a handful as a memorial portion and burns it on the altar. The rest belongs to the priest, like the grain offering. The guilt offering addresses violations of the Lord's holy things. When someone sins unintentionally regarding sacred things, they must bring a ram without defect, valued in silver, as a guilt offering. They must also make restitution for the wrong, adding 1/5 of the value, giving it all to the priest who makes atonement. Chapter 6. The burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering. The Lord gives Moses detailed instructions for the priests regarding various offerings, emphasizing their sacred responsibilities. The burnt offering remains on the altar hearth throughout the night until morning, with the altar fire kept burning continuously. Each morning, the priest dresses in linen garments and undergarments, removes the ashes of the burnt offering consumed by fire, and places them beside the altar. He then changes clothes and carries the ashes outside the camp to a ceremonially clean place. The fire on the altar must be kept burning and never go out. Every morning, the priest adds wood, arranges the burnt offering, and burns the fat of the fellowship offerings on it. The fire must be kept burning on the altar continuously and must never go out. For the grain offering, Aaron's sons present it before the Lord in front of the altar. The priest takes a handful of fine flour and oil, together with all the incense, and burns this memorial portion on the altar as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Aaron and his sons eat the remainder without yeast in the sanctuary area of the courtyard of the tent of meeting. It must not be baked with yeast, as it is most holy, like the sin offering and guilt offering. Any male descendant of Aaron may eat it as a perpetual share of the food offerings. Whatever touches these offerings becomes holy. On the day Aaron and his sons are anointed, they must present a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a regular daily offering. Chapter 7. The guilt offering, the fellowship offering, eating fat, and blood forbidden, the priest's share. The guilt offering is most holy and must be slaughtered in the place where the burnt offering is slaughtered. The priest splashes its blood against the sides of the altar and offers all its fat, the fat tail, the fat covering the internal organs, both kidneys with the fat on them, and the long lobe of the liver. The priest burns them on the altar as a food offering to the Lord. This is the guilt offering, and any male in a priest's family may eat it in the sanctuary area, for it is most holy. The same regulations apply for both sin and guilt offerings. They belong to the priest who makes atonement. The priest who offers a burnt offering keeps the hide. Every grain offering baked in an oven, cooked in a pan, or prepared on a griddle belongs to the priest who offers it. All other grain offerings, mixed with oil or dry, belong equally to all Aaron's sons. The fellowship offering regulations vary depending on the purpose. If offered as an expression of thankfulness, it must include thick loaves and thin loaves made without yeast, along with loaves of bread made with yeast. One portion from each offering becomes the priest's portion. The meat must be eaten on the day offered, leaving none until morning. However, if the offering is a vow or free will offering, it may be eaten on the day it is offered, or on the next day. But anything remaining until the third day must be burned. If meat from the fellowship offering is eaten on the third day, it will not be accepted. Chapter 8. The ordination of Aaron and his sons. The Lord commands Moses to ordain Aaron and his sons to the priesthood, establishing the formal process by which priests enter service. Moses gathers the entire assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting, as the Lord commanded. He washes Aaron and his sons with water, signifying purification before entering sacred service. Moses then dresses Aaron in the priestly garments, the tunic, sash, robe, and ephod with its woven waistband. He places the breastpiece on Aaron, putting the Urim and Thummim inside it. Moses sets the turban on Aaron's head, attaching the gold plate, the sacred emblem, to the front of the turban, exactly as the Lord commanded. Moses then takes the anointing oil and anoints the tabernacle and everything in it, consecrating them. He sprinkles some oil on the altar 7 times, anointing the altar and all its utensils, and the basin with its stand, consecrating them. He pours anointing oil on Aaron's head, anointing him to consecrate him. Moses brings Aaron's sons forward, dresses them in tunics, fastens sashes around them, and puts caps on them, as the Lord commanded. He then presents the bull for the sin offering, and Aaron and his sons lay their hands on its head. Moses slaughters the bull, takes some blood, puts it on the horns of the altar, and pours out the rest at the base, consecrating the altar for making atonement. Moses burns the fat, kidneys, and liver on the altar, but burns the hide, flesh, and intestines outside the camp, as commanded for the sin offering. Chapter 9. The priests begin their ministry. On the 8th day after the ordination ceremony, Moses summons Aaron, his sons, and the elders of Israel to begin the priesthood's formal ministry. Moses instructs Aaron to take a calf for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering, both without defect, and present them before the Lord. Aaron must also tell the Israelites to take specific animals for various offerings: a male goat for a sin offering, a calf and a lamb for burnt offering, an ox and a ram for a fellowship offering, and a grain offering mixed with oil. Moses explains that the glory of the Lord will appear to them this day. The people bring everything to the front of the tent of meeting, and the entire assembly comes near and stands before the Lord. Moses declares that this is what the Lord has commanded them to do, so that his glory may appear. Aaron approaches the altar and slaughters the calf as his own sin offering. His sons bring the blood to him, and he dips his finger in it, puts it on the horns of the altar, and pours out the rest at the base. He burns the designated fat portions on the altar, but burns the flesh and hide outside the camp. Aaron then slaughters the burnt offering, and his sons hand him the blood, which he splashes against the sides of the altar. They hand him the pieces and the head, and he burns them on the altar. He washes the internal organs and legs, and burns them atop the burnt offering on the altar. Leviticus 10. The death of Nadab and Abihu. After the ordination ceremony, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them to offer. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses explained to Aaron that this demonstrated God's holiness and the importance of treating him with reverence. The Lord spoke through Moses, commanding that priests must not drink wine or fermented drink when entering the tent of meeting, so they can distinguish between the holy and common, between the unclean and clean. Aaron was not permitted to mourn publicly for his sons, though his relatives could. Moses became angry when he discovered that the goat of the sin offering had been burned instead of eaten in the sanctuary area. Aaron's remaining sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, had not followed the proper procedure. However, Aaron explained to Moses that after such tragic events had happened to him that day, would the Lord have been pleased if he had eaten the sin offering? When Moses heard this reasoning, he was satisfied with the explanation. This chapter emphasizes the seriousness of approaching God correctly and the severe consequences of failing to honor his specific instructions regarding worship. It demonstrates that even well-intentioned worship, if not done according to God's commands, is unacceptable. The priesthood required strict adherence to divine regulations, and personal feelings could not override established protocols. This tragic incident served as a sobering reminder to all Israel about the holiness of God and the necessity of obedience in worship. Leviticus 11, clean and unclean food. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, providing detailed instructions about which animals the Israelites could eat and which were forbidden. Among land animals, only those that both have a divided hoof, completely split and chew the cud, could be eaten. This excluded camels, rabbits, and pigs. From creatures living in water, only those with fins and scales were acceptable for food. All creatures in the seas or streams without fins and scales were to be regarded as unclean and detestable. The chapter lists numerous birds that were forbidden, including eagles, vultures, ravens, owls, hawks, and bats. Most winged insects were unclean, except those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground, such as locusts, katydids, crickets, and grasshoppers. Animals that walk on their paws were unclean, as were various creatures that move along the ground, including weasels, rats, lizards, and chameleons. Anyone who touched the carcass of an unclean animal became ceremonially unclean until evening and had to wash their clothes. Clay pots that touched carcasses had to be broken, while wooden articles required washing. These dietary laws served multiple purposes. They distinguished Israel from other nations, promoted health and hygiene, and taught the people to make distinctions between clean and unclean in all areas of life. The chapter concludes by emphasizing that God brought Israel out of Egypt to be their God. Therefore, they must be holy because He is holy. These regulations reinforce the concept of separation and consecration to the Lord in everyday life. Leviticus 12. Purification after childbirth. The Lord gave Moses specific instructions regarding ceremonial uncleanness following childbirth. When a woman gave birth to a son, she would be ceremonially unclean for 7 days, just as during her monthly period. On the 8th day, the boy was to be circumcised according to God's covenant with Abraham. The mother then had to wait 33 additional days to be purified from her bleeding. During this purification period, she must not touch anything sacred or enter the sanctuary. If she gave birth to a daughter, the periods of uncleanness doubled. She would be unclean for 2 weeks and would need 66 days for purification from her bleeding. When the days of purification were completed, whether for a son or daughter, she was required to bring specific offerings to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The standard offering consisted of a year-old lamb for a burnt offering and a young pigeon or dove for a sin offering. However, recognizing that not all families could afford a lamb, God made provision for the poor. If she could not afford a lamb, she could bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons instead, one for a burnt offering and one for a sin offering. The priest would make atonement for her, and she would be ceremonially clean. These regulations acknowledged the natural processes of childbirth while maintaining the system of ceremonial purity. They ensured that women could be restored to full participation in community worship after childbirth, demonstrating God's care for all His people. Leviticus 13. Regulations about defiling skin, diseases, and regulations about defiling molds. The Lord provided Moses and Aaron with detailed instructions for diagnosing and managing defiling skin diseases. When someone had a swelling, rash, or shiny spot on their skin, they were brought to Aaron or one of his sons who served as priests. The priest would examine the affected area carefully. If the hair in the sore had turned white, and the sore appeared deeper than the skin. It was a defiling disease, and the priest would pronounce the person unclean. However, if the spot was white, but did not appear deep, and the hair had not turned white, the priest would isolate the person for 7 days. After this period, another examination would determine whether the condition had spread. Various types of skin conditions were described, including chronic diseases, burns that became infected, and sores on the head or chin. The priest's role was crucial in determining ceremonial cleanness. A person diagnosed with a defiling disease had to wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out that they were unclean. They lived alone outside the camp as long as the disease lasted. The chapter also addressed contamination in fabric or leather. If mildew appeared in clothing or leather goods and spread, the contaminated articles had to be burned. These regulations protected the community from contagious diseases while providing a path for restoration when someone was healed, demonstrating both practical health measures and spiritual principles of purity. Leviticus 14. Cleansing from defiling skin, diseases, and cleansing from defiling molds. The Lord gave Moses detailed regulations for the ceremonial cleansing of someone healed from a defiling skin disease. The person was brought to the priest, who examined them outside the camp. If they were healed, the priest ordered 2 live, clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop to be brought for purification. 1 bird was killed over fresh water in a clay pot. The living bird, along with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, was dipped in the blood of the dead bird. The priest sprinkled the person being cleansed 7 times, and then released the living bird into the open field. The cleansed person washed their clothes, shaved off all their hair, and bathed with water. After 7 more days, they shaved again and washed their clothes and body. On the 8th day, they brought specific offerings to the priest: 2 male lambs, 1 female lamb, fine flour mixed with oil, and oil separately. The priest performed various offerings, including guilt, sin, and burnt offerings, making atonement for the person. For those who could not afford 3 lambs, reduced offerings were permitted: 1 male lamb, smaller amounts of flour, and 2 doves or pigeons. Instructions were also given for cleansing houses affected by persistent mildew. The homeowner reported the problem to the priest, who examined the house. If contamination was confirmed and persisted after treatment, Infected stones were removed and the house replastered. If contamination returned, the entire house was demolished. These procedures allowed restored individuals and purified homes to rejoin the community. Leviticus 15. Discharges causing uncleanness. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron about various bodily discharges that caused ceremonial uncleanness. When a man had an abnormal bodily discharge, whether it continued flowing or was blocked, he remained unclean. Anything he sat on or lay on became unclean, and anyone who touched these items had to wash their clothes, bathe with water, and remained unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge spit on someone who was clean, that person had to wash their clothes and bathe. Clay pots touched by the unclean person had to be broken, while wooden articles required rinsing. When the discharge stopped, the man counted 7 days for his ceremonial cleansing, washed his clothes, bathed in fresh water, and became clean. On the 8th day, he brought 2 doves or young pigeons to the priest at the tent of meeting for a sin offering and burnt offering. The priest made atonement before the Lord for the man's discharge. The chapter also addressed normal seminal emissions, requiring bathing and uncleanness until evening. Similar regulations applied to women. During a woman's monthly period, she remained unclean for 7 days, and anyone who touched her became unclean until evening. Anything she sat or lay on during her period was unclean. An abnormal discharge of blood outside her regular period required the same cleansing process as the man's discharge, counting 7 clean days, then bringing offerings on the 8th day. These laws taught Israel to distinguish between clean and unclean, and to approach God's dwelling place with proper reverence and purity. Leviticus 16. The Day of Atonement. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's 2 sons, instructing him about entering the most holy place. Aaron could not come whenever he chose into the sanctuary behind the curtain in front of the atonement cover on the ark, or he would die, because the Lord appeared in the cloud over the atonement cover. Specific preparations were required for Aaron's entry. He had to bathe, put on sacred linen garments, and bring a young bull for his sin offering and a ram for his burnt offering. From the Israelite community, he took 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Aaron first offered the bull as a sin offering for himself and his household, making atonement for his own sins. He took a censer full of burning coals and incense into the most holy place, creating a cloud of incense to cover the atonement cover. He sprinkled bull's blood on the atonement cover and before it 7 times. Then Aaron cast lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and 1 for the scapegoat. The goat chosen for the Lord was sacrificed as a sin offering for the people. Its blood was taken into the most holy place and sprinkled on and before the atonement cover, making atonement for the uncleanness and rebellion of the Israelites. The live goat, the scapegoat, was presented before the Lord. Aaron laid both hands on its head, confessed all the wickedness and rebellion of Israel over it, and sent it into the wilderness, symbolically carrying away the people's sins. After completing these ceremonies, Aaron removed his linen garments, bathed, and offered burnt offerings for himself and the people. Leviticus 17. Eating blood forbidden. The Lord commanded Moses to speak to Aaron, his sons, and all the Israelites about proper sacrifice procedures. Any Israelite who sacrificed an ox, lamb, or goat, either inside or outside the camp, without bringing it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, to present it as an offering to the Lord, was guilty of bloodshed. That person had shed blood and must be cut off from their people. This regulation ensured that sacrifices were brought to the Lord rather than being offered to goat idols in the open fields, preventing the Israelites from continuing their prostitution to false gods. This was to be a lasting ordinance for generations to come. The command applied to both Israelites and foreigners residing among them. Any burnt offering or sacrifice not brought to the tent of meeting to sacrifice to the Lord resulted in being cut off from the people. A central theme of this chapter was the absolute prohibition against consuming blood. Any Israelite or foreigner who ate blood would have God set his face against them and be cut off from their people. The life of a creature is in the blood, and God had given it to them to make atonement on the altar. Blood makes atonement for life, because the life is in the blood. Therefore, no one was permitted to eat blood. Anyone who hunted and caught an animal or bird that could be eaten had to drain out its blood and cover it with earth. The blood of every creature contains its life, so eating it was forbidden. Anyone who ate anything found dead or torn by wild animals had to wash their clothes, bathe with water, and remain unclean until evening. Leviticus 18. Unlawful sexual relations. The Lord spoke to Moses, instructing him to tell the Israelites that they must not follow the practices of Egypt, where they once lived, or of Canaan, where God was bringing them. Instead, they must obey his laws and be careful to follow his decrees, for he is the Lord, their God. Keeping his decrees and laws would bring life to those who obeyed them. The chapter then outlined specific prohibitions regarding sexual relations. No one was to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. This included relations with one's mother, father's wife, sister, granddaughter, stepsister, aunt on either parent's side, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law, a woman and her daughter, or a woman and her granddaughter. A man was forbidden from marrying his wife's sister as a rival wife while his wife was still living. Additional prohibitions included approaching a woman during her monthly period, having sexual relations with a neighbor's wife, sacrificing children to Molech, homosexual relations, and sexual relations with animals. Both men and women were forbidden from these practices. The Lord warned that the nations he was driving out before Israel had defiled themselves through all these practices, and the land had become defiled. Therefore, God was punishing the land for its sin, and the land was vomiting out its inhabitants. The Israelites and foreigners residing among them had to keep God's decrees and laws, avoiding all detestable practices. Anyone who committed these abominations would be cut off from their people. This chapter emphasized maintaining holiness and distinctiveness from surrounding nations. Leviticus 19. Various laws. The Lord speaks to Moses, commanding him to tell the Israelites to be holy because he is holy. This chapter contains a comprehensive collection of laws covering many aspects of daily life and worship. The people must respect their parents and observe the Sabbath. When harvesting crops, they should leave the edges of fields and fallen grain for the poor and foreigners, demonstrating compassion and generosity. The laws prohibit stealing, lying, and deceiving one another. They must not swear falsely by God's name or profane it. Workers deserve fair wages, paid promptly. The people must not curse the deaf or put stumbling blocks before the blind, showing reverence for God. Judges must render honest judgments without favoritism toward rich or poor. The Israelites should not spread slander or endanger their neighbors' lives. They must not hate fellow Israelites in their hearts, but rather rebuke them frankly to avoid sharing their guilt. Vengeance and grudges are forbidden. Instead, they should love their neighbors as themselves. Various regulations follow concerning breeding animals, planting fields, and clothing materials. Laws address sexual relations, fruit trees, eating meat with blood, divination, and occult practices. They must not cut hair at the sides of their heads or clip beard edges. Body markings for the dead are prohibited. Prostitution defiles the land. The people should respect the elderly and rise in their presence. Foreigners living among them deserve love and fair treatment, remembering Israel's own experience in Egypt. Honest scales and measurements are required in commerce. These diverse laws emphasize holiness, justice, compassion, and integrity in all relationships and activities, reflecting God's character throughout Israel's community life. Leviticus 20. Punishments for sin. This chapter establishes severe penalties for violating God's commands, emphasizing the seriousness of sin and the necessity of maintaining holiness. Anyone who sacrifices their children to Molech must be put to death by stoning. If the community fails to act, God Himself will cut off that person and their family. Those who consult mediums and spiritists will be cut off from their people. God repeatedly commands Israel to consecrate themselves and be holy. The death penalty applies to anyone who curses their father or mother. Detailed punishments address various sexual sins. Adultery requires death for both parties involved. A man who sleeps with his father's wife, daughter-in-law, or another man faces execution. Marrying both a woman and her mother results in all three being burned to death. Sexual relations with animals result in death for both human and animal. Marrying one's sister brings public disgrace and childlessness. Specific relationships incur punishment of childlessness, considered a divine curse. Consulting mediums or spiritists leads to being cut off from the community. The chapter concludes with God reminding Israel why He separated them from other nations. They must distinguish between clean and unclean animals, avoiding defilement through creatures God declared unclean. Israel belongs to God, set apart from other peoples to be holy unto Him. These laws distinguish Israel as God's treasured possession, called to reflect His holiness in every aspect of life. The punishments underscore that sin has serious consequences, and that maintaining covenant faithfulness requires vigilance, accountability, and commitment to God's standards throughout the community. Leviticus 21. Rules for priests. God establishes special holiness standards for priests who serve in His presence and represent Him before the people. Priests must not make themselves ceremonially unclean for dead people, except for closest relatives: mother, father, son, daughter, brother, or unmarried sister. They must not shave their heads, trim their beards, or cut their bodies in mourning rituals practiced by pagans. Priests must be holy to God and not profane his name as they present food offerings to the Lord. They cannot marry prostitutes, divorced women, or women defiled by sexual sin, because priests are holy to God. People must regard priests as holy, since they offer food to God. If a priest's daughter defiles herself through prostitution, she disgraces her father and must be burned to death. The high priest faces even stricter requirements. He must not let his hair become unkempt or tear his clothes in mourning. He cannot make himself unclean even for his father or mother, nor leave the sanctuary during mourning, because the anointing oil of God consecrates him. The high priest must marry a virgin from his own people, not a widow, divorced woman, or prostitute, ensuring his offspring remain holy. God tells Moses that no descendant of Aaron with any physical defect may approach to offer food to God, though he may eat the holy food. Defects listed include blindness, lameness, disfigurement, deformity, broken feet or hands, hunched backs, dwarfism, eye defects, skin diseases, damaged testicles, and other conditions. These restrictions do not diminish their value, but recognize that those approaching God's altar must be physically whole, symbolizing the perfection and holiness required in divine service and foreshadowing the perfect sacrifice to come. Leviticus 22. Unacceptable sacrifices. The Lord instructs Moses to tell Aaron and his sons to treat Israel's sacred offerings with respect, not profaning God's holy name. Priests who are ceremonially unclean must not approach sacred offerings, or they will be cut off from God's presence. Conditions causing uncleanness include skin diseases, bodily discharges, touching corpses, touching unclean creatures, or contact with anyone unclean. Priests remain unclean until evening after bathing, then may eat sacred food. They must not eat anything found dead or torn by wild animals, which would make them unclean. Priests who ignore these regulations bear the consequences of their sin and will die. Only priests' family members may eat sacred food. No temporary resident, hired worker, or guest may eat it. However, slaves purchased by priests or born into their household may eat this food. A priest's daughter who marries outside the priesthood cannot eat sacred contributions. But if widowed or divorced without children and returns to her father's household, she may eat her father's food again. Anyone who unintentionally eats sacred food must make restitution plus 20%. Priests must not profane the sacred offerings by allowing unauthorized people to eat them, bringing guilt upon them. Regarding sacrifices, acceptable animals for burnt offerings or fellowship offerings must be without defect from cattle, sheep, or goats. Animals with defects, deformities, injuries, or any imperfection are unacceptable, whether for vow offerings or free will offerings. Animals with damaged testicles cannot be offered. Foreign-sourced animals cannot be accepted because their defects disqualify them. Newborn animals must remain with their mothers 7 days before becoming acceptable offerings. Cows or sheep cannot be slaughtered along with their young on the same day, showing respect for life. Leviticus 23. The appointed festivals. The Lord tells Moses to proclaim his appointed festivals, sacred assemblies for Israel. The Sabbath comes every 7th day as a sacred rest day. The Passover occurs on the 14th day of the first month at twilight. The festival of unleavened bread follows immediately, lasting 7 days, when only unleavened bread may be eaten. The 1st and 7th days are sacred assemblies with no regular work. The Lord requires food offerings during these 7 days. When Israel enters the promised land and harvests grain, they must bring the first fruits sheaf to the priest, who waves it before the Lord. On that day, they offer a year-old lamb without defect as a burnt offering, along with grain and drink offerings. They cannot eat bread, roasted grain, or new grain until bringing God's offering. From the Sabbath, when the wave offering occurs, they count 7 full weeks. Then, on the 50th day, present new grain offerings to the Lord. This festival of weeks involves 2 loaves made with yeast, waved before God along with 7 lambs, 1 bull, and 2 rams as burnt offerings with grain and drink offerings. They also sacrifice 1 goat for a sin offering and 2 lambs for a fellowship offering. When harvesting, they should leave field edges and fallen grain for the poor and foreigners. The Festival of Trumpets occurs on the 1st day of the 7th month, marked by trumpet blasts, sacred assembly, and rest. The Day of Atonement follows on the 10th day, requiring self-denial and food offerings. Anyone who does not deny themselves will be cut off. On the 15th day begins the Festival of Tabernacles, lasting 7 days with sacred assemblies on the 1st and 8th days, celebrating in temporary shelters, remembering Israel's wilderness journey. Leviticus 24. Olive oil and bread set before the Lord. A blasphemer put to death. The Lord commands Moses to have the Israelites bring clear olive oil from pressed olives for the lamps in the tent of meeting, keeping them burning continually before the Lord from evening to morning. Aaron must tend these lamps regularly on the pure gold lampstand. 12 loaves of bread made from fine flour, 2/10 of an ephah each, should be set in 2 rows of 6 on the pure gold table before the Lord. Pure incense accompanies each row as a memorial portion, a food offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath, Aaron must set out this bread before the Lord as Israel's lasting covenant. The bread belongs to Aaron and his sons, who must eat it in the holy place because it represents a most holy part of the food offerings. During this time, an incident occurs involving a man whose mother is Israelite and father is Egyptian. He fights with an Israelite in the camp and blasphemes the name with a curse. The people bring him to Moses. His mother is Shelomith, daughter of Dibri, from the tribe of Dan. They place him in custody until the Lord's will becomes clear. The Lord tells Moses that the blasphemer must be taken outside the camp, where all who heard him shall lay hands on his head. Then the entire assembly must stone him. God establishes the law. Anyone who blasphemes the name must be put to death by stoning, whether foreigner or native born. Anyone who takes a human life must be put to death. Whoever kills someone's animal must make restitution. Anyone who injures their neighbor must receive the same injury. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The same law applies to foreigners and native-born alike. Moses relays these instructions, and Israel executes the blasphemer. Leviticus 25, the Sabbath year, the year of Jubilee. On Mount Sinai, the Lord tells Moses to instruct Israel about Sabbath rest for the land. When they enter Canaan, the land must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years they may sow fields, prune vineyards, and harvest crops. But the 7th year is a Sabbath rest for the land. During this year, they must not sow fields or prune vineyards. They cannot harvest what grows by itself or gather grapes from untended vines. The land must have complete rest. Whatever the land produces during the Sabbath year provides food for everyone. The owner, servants, hired workers, temporary residents, livestock, and wild animals. After 7 Sabbath cycles, 49 years, they must count to the 50th year and consecrate it, proclaiming liberty throughout the land. This year of Jubilee requires everyone to return to their family property and clan. They must not sow or harvest volunteer crops or gather untended grapes, but eat only what fields produce. Property returns to original owners during Jubilee. When selling land, they consider years remaining until Jubilee, essentially selling the number of harvests. More years remaining increases the price. Fewer years decreases it. They must not take advantage of each other, but fear God. Following these decrees and laws brings security and abundant harvests. God promises the 6th year will produce enough for 3 years, sustaining them through the Sabbath year until the 9th year's harvest arrives. Land cannot be sold permanently because it belongs to God. Israelites are merely foreigners and strangers dwelling with him. Throughout the land, people must provide redemption rights for property. If someone becomes poor and sells land, their nearest relative can redeem it. If no one redeems it, it remains with the buyer until Jubilee, when it returns to the original owner. Leviticus 26. Reward for obedience. Punishment for disobedience. God commands Israel to make no idols or images, respect his Sabbaths, and revere his sanctuary. If they follow his decrees and keep his commands, he promises abundant blessings. Rains will come in season, ensuring bountiful harvests. Threshing will continue until grape harvest, and grape harvest until planting, providing plenty of food and security in the land. God will grant peace. They will sleep safely with no one causing fear. Wild animals will be removed, and no sword will pass through their land. They will pursue enemies who fall before them. 5 Israelites will chase 100, and 100 will chase 10,000, as enemies fall by the sword. God will look favorably upon them, making them fruitful and numerous, maintaining his covenant. Old supplies will last so long, they must clear them out for new harvests. God will place his dwelling among them, and not abhor them. He will walk among them as their God, while they remain his people, remembering he brought them from Egypt's slavery. However, if they reject his decrees, abhor his laws, and break his covenant, terrible consequences follow. God will bring sudden terror, wasting diseases, fever consuming their eyes, and draining life. Enemies will eat their crops. He will set his face against them, so enemies defeat them and rule over them. They will flee when no one pursues. If after this they still do not listen, punishment increases 7-fold. Their pride will break. The sky becomes like iron, the earth like bronze. Strength is spent in vain, as land yields no crops, and trees bear no fruit. Continued hostility brings 7-fold increased plagues. Wild animals will destroy their children, livestock, and people, leaving roads deserted. Further rebellion brings sword, plague, and siege. Leviticus 27. Redeeming what is the Lord's. The Lord gives Moses regulations about dedicating people or property to God through special vows. When someone makes a vow, dedicating a person to the Lord by valuation, specific amounts apply based on age and gender. Males aged 20 to 60 are valued at 50 shekels of silver, females at 30 shekels. Ages 5 to 20, males 20 shekels, females 10 shekels. 1 month to 5 years, males 5 shekels, females 3 shekels. 60 years and older, males 15 shekels, females 10 shekels. If someone is too poor to pay the valuation, the priest assesses an amount the person can afford. If the vow involves animals acceptable as offerings to the Lord, such animals become holy and cannot be exchanged or substituted. Attempting to substitute one animal for another makes both holy. Unclean animals, unsuitable for offerings, must be presented to the priest, who determines their value. To redeem it, add 1/5 to the assessed value. When someone dedicates their house to the Lord, the priest assesses its value. To redeem it, add 1/5 to the assessed value, and it returns to the owner. If someone dedicates part of their family land, valuation depends on the seed required for it. 50 shekels for each homer of barley seed. Dedicating land during the year of Jubilee establishes full value. Dedication after Jubilee requires calculation based on remaining years until the next Jubilee. To redeem dedicated land, add 1/5 to its value. If unredeemed or sold to someone else, it cannot be redeemed again. At Jubilee, it becomes holy to the Lord, like devoted fields, becoming priestly property. Fields purchased, but not family land, if dedicated, require valuation until Jubilee, paid immediately as something holy to the Lord. At Jubilee, fields return to original owners.